Dick Wendell, and I'm a SCORE counselor of fairly long standing. It is indeed my pleasure to interview the member of the month, Mary Jane Good, who has been a SCORE counselor for 20 years. Mary Jane, how did you become involved with SCORE, and tell us some of your early experience?
Well, my husband and I wanted to retire near our children. And so we moved back to Cincinnati. My daughter knew that I was planning on joining an organization when I moved back to Cincinnati. And she, in the meantime, had met SCORE's chair, Bob Connor. And she said, "Mama, you've really got to go meet this fella. He's something." So I had the pleasure of that. And then on my way to being interviewed to be a SCORE counselor, being new to the neighborhood and area, I got lost. And I telephoned, and Ernie Nordquist answered the phone. He was the one who was to be interviewing me. And I shared with him that I was lost and it was raining. And I said, "Could you come down to the car? And would you be kind enough to interview me in my car?" And he said, "Well, yes." And so he drove down, found my car, climbed into the back seat. Another counselor climbed into the front, and they interviewed me. And I was accepted. And I guess I might be the only SCORE counselor that was interviewed from one of the people in the back of the car.
Well, that's quite some story. What roles have you been playing, or have you played over all these years with SCORE? I know they've been exciting ones.
Yeah, my first role was onboarding and workshops and working with the outreach program. And one day my phone rang, and it was Ernie Nordquist again, who played a big part in our chapter's history. And he said, "Mary Jane," he said, "I have phoned everybody on this list, and no one will agree to be chair." And I said, "Well, Ernie, you didn't ask me." Dead silence. And finally he said, "Well, would you do that?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to do it." And so that's how I became chapter chair. I served 2 years as assistant chair and then was chapter chair. And when I was assistant chair, this is when we began working strongly on the outreach program. We had the University of Cincinnati for many years. But other than that, we started reaching out. We put a committee together. People started calling. It was a great, great program that we were able to move forward in the chapter. When he asked me to be the chair, at that time, the chapter's chair, the responsibility was to fill all requests that come in. So he would get in the morning that he worked, fill the requests, and go home. And I thought, I don't think I want to do that every day that I'm working. And so I called Dick Baker and I said, "Dick, let's talk." And I shared with him that I felt my skills for the chapter were better used in the field and not behind the desk. And I said, "Can you help me on that?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll come back with something for you." And from that, he created the committee now that places counselors with mentors. And he and Rick Johnson were on that first committee. And it's in existence now and to this day. Probably the most rewarding experience I had when I was chapter chair was number one, being voted nationally the first in the nation and the second year being second runner-up, first runner-up. So those were two things that we were very excited and thrilled happening with us. And as a result of those two awards, I was invited to speak before National and one of their workshops on starting and working on an outreach program. And after my term as chapter chair was over, I received a beautiful plaque from the chapter.
That's terrific. Now, I understand subsequently you became the district director. And what were the highlights of that role that you played for such a good period of time?
Well, I think I was invited to be district director because of the success of the chapter here. And so I was assistant district director for 3 years and district director for 4. And one of the highlights, very strong highlight when I was district director, was our mortar client. Jim Staley, at that time, was the counselor for mortar, and he did an outstanding job of working with them. And at that time, Betsy Newman was with us, and they had an open house. And at the open house, there was Steve Shabbat and dignitaries around the city, and the SBA director for the nation flew in to attend the mortar open house. And mortar was so successful and did such a wonderful job that the chairman of mortar and Staley were invited to speak before Congress in order to support our financial programs with them.
That's quite an achievement. Now I know you've received many awards. Tell us about the award that you received from the Small Business Administration also.
Well, that was a surprise. As district director, I visited each chapter. They were close enough. I visit them each once a month. And when I was in Columbus, I visited the SBA regional director because our Columbus office was right in their office. And I had the pleasure of getting to know him. And I shared with him that it seemed as though we were losing opportunities of learning from one another. Under his direction was the SBDC and ECDI and women's counseling organization. And I suggested to him that we might want to be meeting, all of us, maybe once a month, to discover and to talk about what each one of us were doing. And it worked beautifully. We learned a lot from one another and took information back to our chapter. I took information back to my chapters on that. And I believe from that, that's how I received the award from him.
That's very, very interesting. You know, one of the major cultural changes we've had in SCORE during your activity with SCORE is the increase in number of women in the chapter. When I joined 15 years ago, there were only, I believe, 2 or 3 lady counselors. And today we're up somewhere near 25. And I know that you were very instrumental in having this come about. Can you tell us your role as far as your being an advocate for lady counselors?
Oh, we thank Kelly DeHaan on this one. She and I were talking one day, and we said, what are we going to do in order to increase our women participation? So we came up with the idea of having 3 open houses, one in each area in each of the places where we counseled. And we've had extremely good attendance at all 3 of those. And then we threw it open ask them, what do you want? What do you feel SCORE can do for you in order to help you move your business forward? And out of that came our Women's Roundtable, which has been in existence for this 6 years.
Well, that was quite an achievement and a contribution. Also, you've been very active in our relationship with the African American Chamber of Commerce. Can you comment on that?
I will. When I was chair, we developed that relationship. Steve Love, who was then executive director of that chapter of that chamber, came and spoke to our SCORE people. We would go there. We had classes there. We would speak. I would attend their evening dinner meetings for their members, and they got to know us. So we had an excellent relationship at that time. So I called Eric Kearney, who's now executive director, a couple of years ago, and we invited him to speak before our chapter, which he did. And from that, our relationship has developed. We've had classes with him. Kelly and Kim Jordan and I are now working on a program with Deb Davis to counsel 10 clients that she has working with another organization. And we counsel there and we attend their programs.
Yeah,
So
that certainly has benefited both of our programs. Mary Jane, it has indeed been a pleasure to talk with you today. And do you have any final remarks that you'd kind of like to share with the chair, with the organization?
Just that I don't think of any group that I could have joined that I would have liked more, felt I benefited more from, learned from, and prayerfully supported. And it's been, I've enjoyed every day.
It certainly has been a privilege for us to have had your fine services over such a long period of time. You are a distinguished service person. Thank you so much.